there, and welcome to Power Play. I'm Vashi Capellos on this Tuesday evening, coming to you from Toronto here on assignment. Tonight, it's a big one. Chrystia Freeland quits cabinet again.
She's always a friend. I talk to her almost daily.
It will be a loss. It will definitely be a loss.
The work that Chrystia will lead on Ukraine will be deeply impactful.
Freeland leaves cabinet to be Canada's special representative for the reconstruction of Ukraine. Kicking off a mini cabinet shuffle just last hour, we're going to have the latest breaking details about why now in moments. Then, Scott Moe comes to Ottawa.
To support the federal government in finding a path forward that works for all Canadians.
Fresh off of a trip to China, the Premier is in Ottawa to meet with the Prime Minister for the first time since 2019. We're going to ask him all about that meeting and his trip to China coming up. Plus,
we're going to present a great budget in this House on the 4th of November, Mr. Speaker.
After initially saying there would be an October budget, Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne today announces the Carney government's first fiscal roadmap is coming November 4th. Our front bench will be here to talk about what it all means for the government and for the opposition. That's coming up a little bit later on in the program. First, though.
She's always a friend. I talk to her almost daily, bi-daily, and she's a good person, and she'll do a great job over in Ukraine, and I support her all the way.
She's had literally every tough assignment there is in government, and she's done it, with extraordinary flair.
Chrystia and I are friends. I have a deep respect for Chrystia. There's a little bit of sadness to see her move away from this place, from Parliament, but also I'm happy for her.
She's an extraordinary person, and if Minister Freeland wants to serve in that capacity, I think she would do a wonderful job.
And she's, contributed a lot, I think, to her government and our country, and I wish her all the best.
Some of the reaction there today, both on Parliament Hill and outside of Parliament Hill, to a decision from former Finance Minister, now Transport Minister Chrystia Freeland to exit cabinet once again. Of course, you'll remember it was her resignation from the Justin Trudeau cabinet that essentially led to the former Prime Minister's own decision to step away from politics. At this time, though, it's about her and her decision and what that means for the government moving forward. My colleague, our senior political correspondent here at CTV News, Mike Couture, is tracking all the developments the day. Mike, let's set the scene for everyone watching. There have been rumors for months in Ottawa that something like this was coming for Chrystia Freeland. She wrote today, I'll just pull up if we could, some of her statement. With tremendous gratitude and a little sadness, I've decided to step down from cabinet today, turn the page on this chapter in my life. I do not intend to run in the next federal election. And she went on to say, this line made me laugh. I'm not leaving to spend more time with my family or because the burden of elected office is too heavy to bear. Talk a little bit about this decision today and what we know.
Yeah, it's interesting, especially on that line, Vash, because so many times we hear politicians say that. I mean, even just most recently, Sean Fraser, who was stepping away from politics, came back under Mark Carney. He stepped away under Justin Trudeau, saying it was for his family. And of course, this is something that Chrystia Freeland very clearly saying is not the reason for all of this. Now, I had some sources that are close to the appointment telling me about this job and saying exactly what she would be doing, talking to Canadian business leaders and also Ukrainian business leaders and Ukrainian politicians, trying to really work as hard as they can to rebuild Ukraine, saying how important that is. And she will be making sure that she's making those connections and keeping those connections within the Ukrainian community here in Canada as well. It sounds like she will also be based in this country. It's not like she's moving to Ukraine, but she will go there as needed. Now, as to what led to this and kind of what happens next, well, there had been conversations between the Prime Minister and Freeland and her team about wanting some fresh challenges. And it sounds like they were able to come to this agreement on, this specific job. Very amicable. They were trying to make sure that they were telling people that and also showing that. You saw that Mark Carney, the Prime Minister, and Chrystia Freeland walked out of her last cabinet meeting together. They were chatting, didn't address all of the media that were there, asking all of the questions about what this new job would entail and what it would be. She just walked right by them. But really, that image is what they were trying to portray and continuing to try and hammer home that these are two people who are friends. Let's not forget that Mark Carney is the godfather to one of the children of Chrystia Freeland. So they are trying to continue to really portray that. As for what happens next, because as we had mentioned, she says she's not stepping away from politics just yet. And she did also say that she's not planning to run in the next election. So the Riding Association is trying to figure out what happens, what goes on from here. But right now, it's unclear for how long Chrystia Freeland will remain in the House of Commons as an MP.
Yeah, most people I speak to who have some awareness of her thinking on this seem to indicate that, you know, obviously at some point she is going to have to vacate her seat, but that there's nothing concrete that we can convey essentially this evening, that's a discussion that is going on with the Prime Minister. I think your point about the way in which they attempted to telegraph this in direct contrast, for example, to her initial resignation from the Trudeau cabinet is a salient one. Certainly they are definitely trying to say, this isn't about bad blood. I think at the same time, if you speak to people, you know, in and around the Prime Minister's office, there is certainly a desire to move away from anything that defined the Trudeau era. And if there is, you know, one person atop the protagonist list of the 10 years of Trudeau governing, it's going to be Chrystia Freeland. Like, our audience will be super familiar with her because she led the NAFTA negotiations the first time around. She was foreign minister. She then became finance minister at a time when the country was in, you know, deep crisis, and then ended up basically being the reason that Justin Trudeau quit. Her story is a big part of politics in the last decade.
Yeah, and even if you want to take it back a bunch further to 2013, when she was essentially one of the first star candidates recruited by Liberal leader at the time, Justin Trudeau. She won that by-election in 2013, and that is, as many people can see, you know, one of the cornerstones to the Trudeau cabinet. Of course, when they walked up that driveway to Rideau Hall in 2015, she was there front and center, as you mentioned as well, handling a key number of portfolios, and really, she was just as much the face of the Trudeau government as Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. She was Deputy Prime Minister at one point in time, and a lot of the frustration of Canadians was directed at Chrystia Freeland as well. You remember in Alberta that gentleman trying to go after her essentially as she got in the elevator at a hotel, and she had been there all along, standing next to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, not only when it came to a number of the budgets she delivered, but some of those costly political gimmicks that she had put, and she had said so saliently in that letter when she resigned, that she then pushed back against. And essentially, a lot of people, you know, can look at Chrystia Freeland and talk about how she was, as you mentioned, one of the main protagonists in this story. And then you look at that moment, December 16th, I think, is a day that a number of people on Parliament Hill will remember forever, when she writes that letter, quits cabinet, and essentially starts the process of Justin Trudeau considering, and then eventually, less than a month later, stepping away from politics and saying that he will start a leadership race. Freeland goes into that leadership race hoping to be the next prime minister and eventually loses it. So in a sense, this is, you know, what she had done, delivered Mark Carney into the highest seat of government in this country. And now you have to wonder whether or not Mark Carney is trying to sort of repay the favor and say, we can let you have an exit strategy on your terms here.
I just want to play for our audience, because we just got some reaction from the federal Conservative leader, Pierre Poilievre, on the resignation. Plus, of course, we have to mention the budget date is now out, November the 4th. Take a listen to what Mr. Poilievre just told reporters.
I think it was that she resigned rather than introduce a $62 billion deficit. I think she said the Liberals were trying to force her to introduce a deficit of $62 billion. And she said, this is irresponsible. It is out of control, and it will cause massive inflation. And of course, that deficit went ahead anyway, and now it's even bigger. She's probably trying to get out of town and as far away as possible before this disastrous November budget comes, and I don't blame her.
So, Mr. Poilievre there, Mike, tying the budget, the potential size of the deficit to this resignation. I imagine that the government would push back against that characterization, but I'll leave it there just very, very quickly. What happens now to her portfolio?
Yeah, those have been split up now. Dominic LeBlanc, who was a minister of trade with the U.S. as well, he's now taking on internal trade. He's also the minister of intergovernmental affairs. Steve McKinnon, the government leader in the House, is taking on the transportation role. For now, unclear if we will be seeing other sort of portfolios being moved around, but certainly it looks like all of the people have sat in their seats and the music has stopped for today, Vashi.
Correspondent Mike LeCouture. A lot of other stuff besides this going on the Hill today, including Saskatchewan's Premier Scott Moe, who has just returned from a trade mission to China alongside an appointee from the Prime Minister, Cody Blois. He is back in Canada, I should say, and was in Ottawa today to meet with Prime Minister Mark Carney. He's with us live now from our Ottawa studios. Premier Moe, pleasure to welcome you back to our program. Wish I were there in studio to greet you. Thanks for making the time.
Oh, good to see you, Vashi.
I just actually wanted to start off, if I could, on the news of the day around Chrystia Freeland quitting. I know for a while there, she was kind of the chief liaison between the federal government and provinces. I know there were a number of occasions where you would have worked with her. Were you surprised at all to hear this decision today?
Yeah, I suppose I was. Yeah, I worked quite closely with Minister Freeland at the time. I was chair of the Council of Federation through some challenging times in Canada. And, I think I would say I wish her well in all of her endeavors. And I know that she'll bring a significant amount of effort to everything she does. And that's been my experience of working alongside Chrystia Freeland is there's no shortage of effort and in finding a positive spot with whoever she's working with. So I'm sure our country will continue to be served well by her.
All right, I wanted to ask you about sort of China and then, of course, the meeting with the Prime Minister as well, Premier, and specifically on your trip to China. We spoke before you headed there. There is obviously a lot of concern in your province and right across the canola sector about these very punishing tariffs that have been layered upon each other by China. Speculation is that they're largely in response to the tariffs that Canada has placed on Chinese EVs. We did that back in 2024. Actually, Minister Freeland was one of the lead ministers on that at the time. Did you get explicit clarity from China that that is the reason that they have levied these tariffs on canola products?
We got explicit clarity that there's a willingness to move forward and to look ahead and to recalibrate the trade relationship that we have more broadly, not just specifically to canola and EVs, but more broadly as well. And herein lies the challenge that we have as Canadians is our largest trading partner is to the south of us. It's the United States of America. China, likely our second largest trading partner. And how do we balance those markets alongside many other markets around the world in an environment, an international environment that is changing rapidly and where one decision with one country can have some indirect impact in another country. And so we were happy that the Chinese officials that we met with are willing to look ahead and to engage in a dialogue on what a constructive path forward will look like.
I guess the reason I asked the specific nature of my original question, and I take your point that there's a willingness, and certainly when we interviewed the Chinese ambassador, there was a clear desire on the part of China to signal that to Canada already months ago. But I think that Canadians are interested to figure out what exactly that looks like. For example, in order for our canola sector to not be punished in the way that it is, are we going to have to remove those tariffs on EVs, tariffs which I'll remind our audience were brought in by the government who wanted to work in concert with the United States and the EU at the time and cited even national security concerns for imposing them. So did China tell you that those tariffs would have to go in order for the canola ones to?
It's one of the irritants, and there's irritants on both sides. Canada has, trade issues with China, notably canola, but there's irritants on the other side as well, whether it be EVs or other products as well. So it is one of the parts of the dialogue that needs to happen. And as we look forward to the next number of weeks and months, what I would hope is that there's an increasing frequency of that dialogue, increasing presence of Canadian ministers meeting with their Chinese counterparts, so that we can find a spot that is, constructive for both countries moving forward. Mexico has a different tariff level. The European Union has a different tariff level as well, and so they've been able to find, to some degree, a path forward with both China and the U.S. And that's the work that we need to do, and we're going to support the federal government in whatever way we can to ensure that happens sooner rather than later.
Is it your view, based on your conversations in China, that there is potentially a path out that isn't kind of all or nothing? And I ask because there are multiple reports right now about Europe, for example, which again, as I'll remind our audience, like worked in concert with the US and Canada to levy these EV tariffs in the first place. It sounds like they're on their way to reach an agreement with China to set like a floor for prices, for example, for EVs. Was there any signal to you during this trip that China would be open to such a discussion or path forward with Canada like that?
I believe so, and that's why the frequency of the dialogue and the engagement has to happen. And I'm confident it will, after meeting with the industry and the Prime Minister and a number of ministers, Minister McDonald, Minister Sidiou, as well as Parliamentary Secretary Cody Blois again today. And so, you know, it's through that engagement, that dialogue, that we're actually going to find this path forward and discuss some of the challenges that are very evident and before us. And you've struck, you know, on one of them is the 100% EV tariff. That is one of the issues that the Chinese have. But I don't believe that it's always an all or nothing conversation. And so we're hopeful that we'll be able to find a landing spot sooner rather than later. This calendar year would be great, and there's some opportunities to elevate this in the appropriate way, right ultimately to the Prime Minister of Canada and the President of China to find you know, that constructive path forward and what it might look like. So that's what we're hopeful in doing, and that's what our mission was focused on, was taking the first steps in ensuring that we get to that point sooner rather than later.
When you mention hopeful for, you know, that dialogue to take place or for a resolve or a solution by the end of the year, can you be specific? You know, have you received assurances from the Prime Minister in your meeting, for example, today, that he will speak to his Chinese counterpart?
Well, there's a process for that to happen, and so what I would hope for, and what we discussed today, was what opportunity do we have for federal ministers and maybe the Parliamentary Secretary Cody Blois as well to either return to China or to continue with the engagement and keep the momentum going that occurred here this past week with the time that we spent on the ground in China. And there was momentum that was built in the work between our provincial trade office, the ambassador, the embassy, and myself and the Parliamentary Secretary that were on the ground. But a lot of engagement needs to happen, whether it's industry to industry, federal government to federal government, minister to minister. And I'm confident that the federal ministers that I spoke to today understand that and are you know, putting that into their schedule in the immediate future.
What can you tell Canadians who are listening tonight, or say to assure them about what precedent we could be setting if we essentially go down a road where we backtrack on something that we vociferously, and I say we sort of in the collective, but our federal government vociferously defended? Those tariffs were applied to counter what they deemed to be totally unfair trade practices and labor practices occurring, for example, in China. They cited national security at the time for imposing them, and our biggest trading partner still has them in place in the United States. Despite everything, and I know you agree with this, despite everything, we still are very interconnected with the United States. Like, what can you say to assure Canadians that we aren't setting a very dangerous precedent by essentially backing down on something that we said we had to do?
This is not backing down, and I disagree. It's not backtracking in any way. It's finding a path forward for what has been a significant market for many Canadian products for the last number of years, if not decades. But we mustn't never forget that this is the new normal in trade negotiations and global relations moving forward. And it looks very different than it did a year ago. And so we need to prioritize, you know, who our largest trading partners are and our most significant allies, and that is the United States of America. And we're in the midst of, you know, really recalibrating that relationship, as well as Minister LeBlanc is essentially taking up residence, I think, with outside Minister Lutnick's or Secretary Lutnick's office in Washington. But second to the United States, China is our second largest market, and I think a significant market for Canadian products as well. And so, despite many differences that we have exported products to China for decades now, and I think it's important that we continue to be open to that into the future. And so this isn't, you know, backtracking in any way, but it's controlled dialogue and ensuring that we have market access for the products that are creating wealth for Canadians, not just in our province, but in this case, the canola industry, over 200,000 Canadians across the nation.
And I certainly take your point on that, and I know that, you know, the impacts on the sector have been devastating, to say the least. I would respectfully counter, though, on the impetus for using the characterization that we're backtracking. I mean, China levied, like in response to that original set of tariffs, started punishing our canola sector with very, very, very significant tariffs. They did that, and now all of a sudden, we want to be in conversation about what we can do to kind of, we're open to bringing these other tariffs away, that kind of thing. Like, they justified the tariffs in the first place with some very serious reasons to Canadians. And now because China hits back hard at us, we're saying, okay, well, maybe it's not that serious at all. Like, can you understand how Canadians would have the impression that we're kind of kowtowing to a powerful move from China, and that could set a dangerous precedent?
And I think other countries, including China, might question, our justification of the initial tariffs. And we know why they're in place as Canadians. But I would put forward this, Vassie. Mexico has found a path forward with a reduced tariff, still a tariff on Chinese EVs coming into that country. The entirety of the European Union has been able to find a path forward as well, with a reduced but still a significant tariff on EVs as well, coming into their collective group of companies. And so it's through dialogue, starting with the ministers, ultimately ending with the Prime Minister and the President of China. But it's through that dialogue that we'll be able to find that constructive path forward. And we need to. Because at the end of the day, it's not just the canola market that is impacted, but it's many other markets that are being impacted, and many other communities from coast to coast to coast in our nation. And so we need to find that balance on, what does our path forward look like with the United States of America, but also find that balance with what does our path forward look like with many, many other countries as well, including China.
Even if it means compromising our values? Because that's what it could feel like to
Certainly.
A lot of Canadians.
Well, if you look to our trading relationship with China prior to Canada implementing the EV, steel, and aluminum tariffs and quotas, we were trading quite freely with respect to the exports that were flowing from Canada into China. And so, if that is the baseline, I don't know that we're going to get back to that, free and open trade with China. But we might be able to, through dialogue, find a place that's palatable for all of the industries, and continues to ensure that Canadians can generate income and have a job. And in this case, with the canola industry specifically, never mind the pork industry, the seafood industry, it's 200,000 Canadians.
Okay, I'm going to leave it on that note. Premier Mo, I appreciate your time. As always, thanks so much.
Thank you, Vassie.
Thank you. Scott Moe is, of course, the Premier of Saskatchewan. We'll take a quick commercial break here on Power Play, but the front bench is standing by to take a deep dive into our top story. Chrystia Freeland quits cabinet again. Dan Moulton, Larissa Waller, Kathleen Monk, and Laura Stone join me in 2 minutes.
These things are really grinding to be in cabinet for such a long period of time. There's an element of personal decision-making that I have no insight on, but I wish her all the best.
It'll be sad to see her go, but Chrystia is always one that wants to be challenged.
She's going to be doing a great job in Ukraine. I mean, she's been a total committed on that file for a long time, well before she got into politics.
We need someone who has her smarts, her intelligence. She speaks the language, she speaks it fluently, she knows the country, she has respect of the Ukrainian people, so I can't think of anything better.
Liberal colleagues there weighing in on the resignation, the announcement from former Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland, now serving as Transport Minister, that she would be vacating that position. The Prime Minister very shortly thereafter announcing her appointment to be a special envoy for the reconstruction of Ukraine for Canada. A lot of this is happening after a long 10 years, you could say, for what has become, or who has become, a very well-known politician in this country. And there's a lot to unpack about why this happened, why now, and what it means more largely for the government. No better people to do that than our front bench this evening. With me, former senior advisor to the Liberal Ontario governments of Dalton McGuinty and Kathleen Wynne. Dan Moulton is here. He's now a partner with Crestview Strategy. Larissa Waller is the founder of Henley Strategy. She's a former head of communications for Ontario's Progressive Conservative Premier Doug Ford. Kathleen Monk is the former director of communications to the late Jack Layton. She's now the principal owner of Monk and Associates. And Laura Stone rounds us out. She's a Queen's Park reporter for the Globe and Mail. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Nice to see you.
Hi.
Dan, I'm going to start with you on this one. I feel like the rumor mill had been going for months about some sort of international appointment for Chrystia Freeland. How much of this do you think is her, and how much of this do you think is the people around Carney and Carney himself?
Well, I think you're right, Vassy. This has been some time coming. It feels like just yesterday we were in your studio in Ottawa together the day Chrystia Freeland announced she was resigning in protest to Justin Trudeau's leadership. Yeah. And I mean, look, it's been a long road since then. I think since her decision to put her hat in the ring for the Liberal leadership following Trudeau's resignation and the outcome of that leadership process, it's been clear that she was going to be thinking about a future outside of Canadian politics and outside of elected office in the Canadian Parliament. I think this is probably her first clear step in that direction. It's difficult to be thinking about the next role, the next chapter of her career, and seeking it out while you're in the federal cabinet. And so I think this is a step towards her determining what her next chapter is going to look like and what her future is going to hold. As you mentioned, this has been something that's been widely expected throughout the summer months. The timing, I think, is a bit odd. I think it would have made sense to have got this out of the way prior to Parliament resuming. The government was obviously out pretty fast today to announce the timeline of the budget, which I know we'll have some time to talk about today, and that I think helped to start to move the headlines past this. But I mean, certainly it is going to be a big topic of conversation, and attention I think will continue to be paid to both Chrystia Freeland's exit from the cabinet and the future of her career.
I know that Kathleen, the government in this case, and Freeland went to great lengths to project the image that, like, this is kumbaya, in stark contrast to round one, which Dan mentioned, of course, was a completely different story. Talk a little bit, if you could, about why that's something that they want to project and what you think of the reasoning that's being presented so far about why this is happening now.
Yeah, lots of happy photos, backslapping, and cheerful looks coming out of cabinet for both of them. And I think it's important, certainly for Carney's government, to have that there's not really a huge division. But let's be clear, Chrystia Freeland ran again in the last election. She wanted to be a part of this government and a part of cabinet. But following the construction of Carney's cabinet, she didn't get the kind of profile she had in previous government. So, you know, she wasn't a part of the important cabinet committees, things like the Priorities and Planning Committee. She had a much diminished role in transport. Transport is still a big file, but even the scope of her work there was, diminished to some extent. So I think it was her choice to leave. She wanted to leave because she likes being, having a powerful role. And let's be clear, she will be remembered as a very elite part of some very powerful cabinet ministers that Canadians have had in our history. People like C.D. Howe, people like Marc Lalonde, people like Don Mazikowski, or even Anne McClellan. You know, these are the super ministers, if you will, people that have held multiple portfolios, who have done big things, have been considered by prime ministers to be their fixer. She did an enormous amount of good for our country as minister. She was principled and delivered on critical files. And I think history will be kind to her, even though many times in her role in politics, people have not been kind to her. But I think, in fact, history will look back on her as really having a really consequential role in Canadian politics.
Yeah, I'm sure, like, I'll leave it to everyone to debate the merits of that, of the sort of the legacy. But I will say, to Kathleen's point, Larissa, if you were to write the book of Justin Trudeau's time in office, like, it's him and she's the next biggest protagonist. Like, I think Canadians, certainly when they view that government, identify her as one of the most front-facing people of the government. Now, that could be a good or bad thing in the future, but I do think it does inform sort of why there's so much focus on this decision today.
Exactly, and I don't think they want me to write that book, but but I'd be happy to do so.
No, thank you.
You know what? In a lot of cases, you know, the Ottawa rumor mill would say that Chrystia Freeland, when it came to the finances, was in charge. You know, historically, PMO runs a tight ship in every government. But Chrystia Freeland is known to have been the driving force on a lot of policies that I probably disagree with Kathleen, weren't so great. And we saw that deficit balloon, which she, you know, famously resigned over her own deficit. I wear two hats here. I'm a partisan conservative, and I can talk to you all about the things that I think Chrystia Freeland did wrong as finance minister. I'm also a Ukrainian Canadian. that hat that Larissa wears is happy that Chrystia Freeland was in such an influential position, because I think especially in the early days of the war, it really was Chrystia Freeland that brought the international community together and solidified, kind of helped other leaders understand the risk that Putin poses to the West generally. I'm kind of like, taking a little bit of a pause here, because if there's one person in the world that can't stand Chrystia Freeland, it's Donald Trump. And if we're looking at rebuilding Ukraine and ending this war, Donald Trump's going to play a role there. So I'm worried that it's going to be, poking him in the eye just a little bit.
She is. I mean, she's focused on reconstruction, so maybe that's like the post. That's
once
more,
there's peace.
More, yeah, exactly. So not the peace process, but I do take the point. I will say, Laura, that just as someone who's covered, I don't know, a zillion of these resignations, it was a breath of fresh air to read in the statement, I am not leaving to spend more time with my family. It was actually like a pretty candid statement overall. What's your impression of, I guess, why Chrystia Freeland might be leaving, but also I think, it's a bit of a relief to the Carney government to have another reason to turn the page on, politically speaking, what they want to, away from the record of the previous government?
Well, look, there seem to be two rules in Canadian politics. One is no one resigns more than Chrystia Freeland, and two, no one gets more jobs than Dominic LeBlanc, who picked up another one today. I mean, look, there's definitely not like the scorched earth vibes of the previous resignation letter, which was, it seemed, there was a highly personal falling out and mismanagement on the part of the Justin Trudeau Prime Minister's office versus what happened here. This obviously seemed like part of a negotiation between the two parties, and Prime Minister Carney wanted to ensure that Chrystia Freeland left happy, and it seems that she did. That the resignation letter has very positive undertones, and it's not like they were filling a position that had gone unfilled. They've created this for her, so they've obviously wanted to make her happy. I find it interesting that there's no kind of timeline on her stepping away from her duties as a member of Parliament, which to me suggests that the Carney government still needs the votes, right? I mean, they're in a precarious position as a minority government, and maybe there was some agreement there for her to stay on, while they get through some of the difficult votes, including the budget that's coming up and other key pieces of legislation. I think, it seems to me that they were both happy to move on here. I mean, Chrystia Freeland left the Trudeau cabinet. She ran for leader against Mark Carney, the person who was supposed to potentially replace Trudeau. She lost by a very wide margin, and then she kind of had to dust herself off and return. And that was probably a difficult reality for her to face. So she seems like she's done with that element of her public life. And for Prime Minister Carney, he had not elevated her to a position where she was as public facing as she had been in the Trudeau government. And so I think this chapter seems somewhat resolved for both sides here.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, I'll leave it on that note. We'll take a quick break. The front bench will return with me after that break. We've got to talk about the budget. Why? Because today the federal government announced a date for it, November the 4th. We're back in 2 minutes to talk about that.
We're going to present a great budget in this House on the 4th of November, Mr. Speaker. This is going to be a generational investment in our future. We're going to build this country, Mr. Speaker. We're going to protect our communities. We're going to empower Canadians. We're going to build the strongest economy in the G7.
And with that, the federal government announces a date for the upcoming fall budget. It will happen or it will be tabled, I should say, on November the 4th. The finance minister had previously, I believe in an interview, I think it was last month, told CTV it was coming in October. Now it turns out it's going to be the first week of November, perhaps speaking to some of the complexity behind the document, which will, of course, be a central piece of this fall sitting, the marquee piece of legislation that the government announces. Here's a little bit about how the back and forth over not just budgets, but cost of living and new inflation numbers went down in the House of Commons today.
Food bank lineups are growing and growing at an accelerating rate under this Prime Minister.
Last night, Canada and British Columbia approved the new Silicem LNG export terminal in northern British Columbia.
The question was not about re-announcing a previously approved project. It was about the cost of food. And frankly, it is insulting. We have asked 10 questions about the cost of food in the last 2 days, and not a single Liberal minister will get up and answer it.
Well, I know we're all in this House concerned about the price of food, and we're also concerned about our farmers. The #1 cost of living in Canada is related to housing. People are concerned about housing prices. This government is taking action to make housing more affordable.
All right, let's bring back the front bench to talk about that. Dan Moulton, Larissa Waller, Kathleen Monk, and Laura Stone are all back. Kathleen, I'll start with you. I thought that back and forth was interesting because it shows sort of the difference in focus heading into the budget, right? The Conservatives continue to talk. I mean, today was inflation, so it's somewhat understandable, but they continue to really drone in and focus in on cost of living issues. And you've got Liberals talking about some of the macro big stuff that they're doing, big housing agency that they announced, for example, approving big projects. What does that tell you about how the two parties might shape up against each other as we head into the season of the budget?
Well, it certainly tells me that Pierre Poilievre has honed his communication skills over the last 20 years of being in Parliament. In fact, Wayne Lawn had this hilarious line in question period today where he said, how can this guy even talk about the economy when Mr. Poilievre has never actually worked in the economy, which was actually probably the best line of the day. But in terms of the fight over messaging, the Conservatives are clearly winning because they're focusing on the issue that matters most to Canadians, affordability, the cost of groceries, how increasingly life is unaffordable. And as we move into this budget that's now been kicked down by 2 weeks later into November, I think that we have to think about, what Carney's doing. And what he's promised to do is actually make deeper and more severe cuts than Stephen Harper made, with the DRAP cuts in the 2000s. In fact, they're closer to what they did in the 90s when the Liberals last desperately and deeply cut transfers to the provinces and some of our social services that Canadians really rely on. And so when Mr. Poilievre is speaking in the House and talking about how to make Canadians' life more affordable, I wonder, what does he think about how you actually make Canadians' life affordable? We're not just in an economic crisis. We're in an inequality crisis. We're in a crisis, a social cohesion crisis right now. And the way you make actually a country work is actually asking yourself questions, what makes the economy grow and what makes it stall out? And when you're sitting in traffic or when you don't have health care or you don't have child care, these are the things that prevent the economy from growing. And those are the things that consistently Pierre Poilievre and the Conservative opposition have opposed.
It'll be interesting to see, Dan, and I'll get you to respond to that. I mean, in the previous iteration of the government, quite frequently, whenever a debate would emerge about the level of spending or the budget, the Trudeau government would kind of fight back with a similar characterization, right? Like, well, you're against this, you're against that, these programs, you're going to take away all these programs. It became part of the narrative of the federal election even as well. Does it become harder to do that when, yes, on one hand, the Prime Minister this time around is saying we're not going to cut that stuff, but on the other hand, there's way more emphasis on spending less?
Yeah, no, certainly you outlined the challenges finance minister and this government's going to continue to face as we inch closer to that budget, which is they have a great deal to deliver and to do in this document. I think the big speculation right now is the extent to which we see something that's called a budget, but looks and feels a lot more and is delivered at the same time as a fall economic statement would be, and how broad of a policy agenda this budget will be versus a clear indication of where the nation's finances are at, where the federal government's finances are at, and a delivery of advancement on the platform that the Liberals tabled during the election. What I will say is we're going to continue to hear New Democrats, as we've just heard Kathleen say, that the government's cutting too much. We're going to continue to hear Conservatives say that the government's not cutting enough. I think, like most things in life, when you're not keeping either of those groups happy, you're probably doing something right.
What do you think about that, Larissa? Because that's something that you do hear from Liberals, right? That's not they don't think it's a bad spot to be in, essentially being criticized from both sides.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's true. What Dan said is, it's every negotiation. If both parties are unhappy, you're probably somewhere in the middle. But when you hear Minister Champagne say something like, this budget's going to have generational investment, That sounds very expensive. If they're promising generational investment after the last 10 years of a Liberal government that saw our broader public service grow by 40%, I'm kind of worried to see what that means. And I appreciate that it's a communications challenge to the general public about why government spending makes things more expensive. But I think the one guy who can do that and has done that and will continue to do that is Pierre Poilievre. He's very good at linking how government excess and government bloat and government spending makes prices go up. He did that leading into the last election. I think you're going to see more of that because that's kind of his sweet spot. And that's what people are worried about, and that's what people are talking about. And it's very hard for the federal government to help Canadians across the country understand why an LNG project in BC helps a family in Ontario or Nova Scotia. That's really hard to do. Pierre's in a much better spot than Carney is in the communications war that the budget's going to be.
Well, I think Larissa brings up an interesting point, Laura, which is the government, and it's kind of why I chose that back and forth in the House of Commons, because the government is going to have to make a big effort in describing to people, because the fact is that LNG project could make someone's life better off. Like, it could raise increase the size of our economy and our exports would become less reliant. Like, there are ways to say, here's how it affects your life. But so far, and I'll take the housing example, the housing announcement as an example, like trying last night to get that out of the housing minister, like what does this mean for someone who can't afford a house in Toronto was very difficult to do. Like they will have to make a really concerted effort to try and describe like why these big macro things actually matter to everyone who's watching tonight.
Yeah, I mean, clearly the Conservatives and the Liberals are up against each other, framing this as a short-term versus a long-term issue, and the Conservatives are hitting harder on the impatience of it all and trying already to frame the Prime Minister and the Liberals as a disappointment and not living up to the promises that they made in the election. I think the challenge here for the government is just the mixed messaging that we've heard so far on the budget and the country's finances, because they are sort of presenting, and the finance minister is sort of presenting this budget in a positive, chipper way, while at the same time sending these messages that there will be cuts, and we've heard the term austerity and tough choices is something that he's said as well. So it's difficult to know exactly where the government is headed at this juncture. And I think just kind of putting off the budget, saying previously this year that there wouldn't be one and now kicking it down the road a little bit later in the year maybe doesn't send the strongest signal to the public that things are going well or that they need more time to get a handle on it. But I just think right now the framing for the general public is a little bit confusing as to where the government is going with this. And I assume we'll get some clarity, obviously, when we see the budget on what these long-term investments are versus the spending cuts that we're expecting. But I think right now there are some challenges on the government's part, particularly from a communications perspective, on just setting up the expectations for exactly what kind of budget we're supposed to be getting.
Well, the good news for them and for us is we've got like 7 weeks to talk about this ad nauseum, and they can make their framing decisions along the way. Yeah, I'll leave it there. Guys, thanks so much for the great discussion. I really appreciate it, as always. Dan Moulton, Larissa Waller, Kathleen Monk, and Laura Stone, our wonderful front bench. We'll take a quick break here on Power Play. We're back right after that break.
I am filing a notice of intent to seek the death penalty. I do not take this decision lightly, and it is a decision I have made independently as county attorney, based solely on the available evidence and circumstances and nature of the crime.
The state of Utah, as you hear there, will seek the death penalty against Tyler Robinson, who is the suspect in the murder of Charlie Kirk. Charlie Kirk, of course, a well-known key activist for Donald Trump and key part of the MAGA movement, who was shot and killed at Utah Valley University last week. Robinson faces a total of 7 charges, including one for aggravated murder just this past hour. In fact, he appeared virtually in court for the first time.
State of Utah versus Tyler James Robinson. Could you state your name?
Tyler James Robinson.
On September 10th, 2025 in Utah County, the defendant, Tyler James Robinson, intentionally or knowingly caused the death of Charlie Kirk under the following circumstances. The defendant knowingly created a great risk of death to another individual other than Charlie Kirk and the defendant. Notice conviction of this offense may carry the death penalty.
The suspect there in the murder case for Charlie Kirk, or I should say accused in the murder of Charlie Kirk, appearing in court virtually there for the first time. The state of Utah, again, will seek the death penalty in this case against Tyler Robinson. We imagine we will have much more reaction to that decision flowing throughout the evening. We will, of course, convey any of that reaction as it comes into our newsroom. We're going to take a quick break. On the other end of that break here on Power Play, we'll return to our top story. Chrystia Freeland quits cabinet again, and our takeaway from that. Back in a moment.
We're going to present a great budget in this House on the 4th of November, Mr. Speaker. This is going to be a generational investment in our future. We're going to build this country, Mr. Speaker. We're going to protect our communities. We're going to empower Canadians. We're going to build the strongest economy in the G7.
Welcome back to Power Play. A little bit of a double-barreled takeaway for you this evening. First part right there, the Finance Minister, François-Philippe Champagne, announcing there is a date for the budget. November the 4th is the one that the government has chosen. Now, I will point out that Minister Champagne told CTV News in an interview, I believe it was last month, that the budget was set for October, so this is certainly a little bit later than that. I will also point out that over the weekend, the Prime Minister said that the budget's deficit would be, quote-unquote, substantial. So there are many question marks hovering around where things go from a fiscal perspective. I will also point out that we've got some new data that might help inform at least some part of the bottom line, and that is around inflation and the Bank of Canada's interest rate announcement. Let me pull it up for you on screen. Inflation, we found out this morning for the month of August, rose a couple of 0.2 percentage points to 1.9%. That wasn't as big of a jump, though, as some economists had predicted. So now, as a result, there is widespread sort of consensus among private sector economists that the Bank of Canada will likely cut the rate tomorrow, and that they could also cut the rate again in October, so we'll stay tuned for that. I will also say the other big part of our tonight's takeaway is Chrystia Freeland quitting cabinet. She will become the government's special representative for the reconstruction of Ukraine. She remains as an MP, and no details at this point in time about when she will quit that post. I will leave our program Power Play there for now. We have lots more reaction to all of what you just heard tonight on CTV News Channel. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you tomorrow.